Hello and welcome back to the channel, and today I'm going to talk about Japanese Spider-Man. This is a show that I've always wanted to watch for a while, and I finally got around to it this past month, and it definitely surprised me with how good it was. I didn't think anything Spider-Man related would be able to top Spider-Man 1 and 2 by Sam Raimi, but this did, and just surprising at how good the show was in its entirety, and honestly ended up being my favorite tokusatsu show of all time now. So today I'm going to talk about why Japanese Spider-Man is the greatest tokusatsu show ever made. Or is it? Yeah, in all seriousness, the show is actually not very good from a quality perspective, surprising, but from a quality perspective, it's actually one of the worst tokusatsu shows I've ever seen. But even so, it is a very important tokusatsu show, probably the most important tokusatsu show, at least from my perspective, because of how it eventually led to tokusatsu being in the West. And in that case, it is the greatest tokusatsu show. So I'll start off talking about the show itself, what I liked about it, but mostly what I didn't like about it. And then finally I'll talk about just the production of the show overall, because I think that's what led to it being, in retrospect, one of the most influential tokusatsu seasons. So for real now, this is my review of Japanese Spider-Man. So I first heard about this show probably in between the time when I was falling out of Power Rangers. I just heard about this wacky Japanese Spider-Man show that was kind of like Power Rangers. Didn't really think much about it. And then before going into high school, I read Ready Player One, and Spider-Man's mecha shows up in that, so that learned more about that. I learned about most of this show from a Disney Plus documentary series, Marvel 616. One of the episodes is on Japanese Spider-Man. It's not on Disney Plus anymore for some reason, but pretty interesting episode. I learned about the production of this show, and that kind of got me interested in eventually checking it out for real, but I never actually got around to watching it until now. So as for my overall thoughts about this show, as I mentioned earlier, it's probably one of the worst tokusatsu shows I've ever seen, but that doesn't mean it wasn't enjoyable. I had a lot of fun watching it. Just the novelty of it, seeing like an American superhero adapted in another country is always interesting to me. I do like that they strayed really far from the source material. I know a lot of people probably hate it for that, but I always like straying from the source material. Like, it's really funny, obviously unintentionally so, but it's still really funny. Some cool ideas, but overall, it just feels like they took Spider-Man and they just shoved it into a generic tokusatsu hero template. There's no overarching story at all. Every single episode is basically standalone. So much of it is just filler child nonsense. Characters aren't really memorable at all. So once the novelty runs out, it just becomes a really boring show to watch through. But again, still had its novelty, still had its fun. I wouldn't call it the absolute worst tokusatsu show I've ever seen. I still think Kamen Rider Gotchard is worse, but this is definitely down there as one of the worst tokusatsu shows I've ever seen, even if I had fun watching it. Now we're going to talk about the characters, and Takia is just a really boring protagonist. He is mostly just generic Toku hero. He at least has some sort of personality where he has to act like a loser when he's a civilian in order to hide his identity as Spider-Man, like Superman does. But other than that, he's just really boring. Nothing really to him. I do find it interesting that, in contrast to comic Spider-Man, who was taught not to fight out of revenge and to fight out of responsibility, this Spider-Man very overtly fights out of revenge, which is just really interesting difference between comics. The show goes really hard to tell you how vengeful he is that the Uncross Army killed his father. So that's interesting, but I mean, as far as his personality goes, he's a very generic protagonist. Garya is a really interesting idea for a character. He's an alien who was shot down by the Uncross Army and then gives Spider-Man his powers. And it would be cool if he stuck around as a mentor, even if he was just a spider. But he dies in episode 2 out of nowhere, so that's just it. And nothing's really done with him. It just would be really interesting for Spider-Man to have a mentor, because, I don't know, I feel like the show is missing something, and maybe giving Spider-Man a mentor would be cool instead of having him die pretty much immediately after he gives Spider-Man the powers. The other characters really don't matter. There's Shinko, who's Takia's sister, and then there's Hitomi, who I don't really know what her relationship is with Takia. Like, is she his friend? Is she his girlfriend? Is she his employer? Because Takia always drives her around. In any case, none of the characters, pretty much besides Takia, matter at all in the show. There is a cool cowboy narcotics detective named Tachibana, who's played by the same guy who was Big One in Jaka, and he's really cool. In the 2 episodes he shows up, he just feels like another hero in the world, and reminds me a lot of the episodes from the 90s animated Spider-Man where like Blade or Iron Man show up, and that's really cool. But it just sucks that he's only in 2 episodes, so he's basically just a filler character. Now I'm going to talk about the villains, and they aren't horrible. They're just pretty generic. My favorite part about the Iron Cross Army is that the show does a really good job of showing how evil they are. Like, they capture humans and augment them, they mistreat animals, and they kill a bunch of people in cold blood. And it actually matters here because a lot of people die, they aren't saved by Spider-Man, so it feels like the Iron Cross killing them actually has like a tangible impact. So that's my favorite part about them. But when it comes to the villains themselves, they aren't super interesting. Professor Monster is a really generic main villain, kind of just sits around until the end. Amazonas is the villain with the most screen time. She's kind of the Professor Monster's right-hand man who, every single episode, she's the one carrying out the plans. She's fine, but not really that memorable. She at least has a character moment in the finale when she gets jealous of the other two Amazons and they betray her, but that's literally the only character moment in the entire show that the villains get, and it happens in the finale. So they're decent, like especially in comparison to other Toku of the same era, but overall they're just really generic. The worst part of the villains though is the monsters of the week. They are so boring, and also they're almost never relevant to the plot of the episode they're in, which is just kinda strange. They kind of feel like they're just there out of obligation. And it sucks because there are a couple of episodes, especially later in the season, that have more unique villains like Dr. Miracle and Great King Enma, who aren't just the rubber-suited monsters of the week and feel more like comic book supervillains. And that would have been really cool if it was more throughout the season, but it's kind of just in those 2 episodes, and every other episode just has a stupid monster of the week that just shows up out of nowhere when they just need to. So probably the worst monster of the week I've ever seen in any Toku. Now I just want to talk about the similarities and differences between this version of Spider-Man and comic version of Spider-Man. Pretty much he has all the same powers: wall climbing, web shooting, improved healing. In this version he can at least communicate with spiders, which is kind of funny. But that's kind of where the similarities end. He has a car and he has a mecha, which I think are the 2 things people know most about this version of Spider-Man. He obviously fights out of revenge, rather out of responsibility. I guess another similarity is that both versions of Spider-Man had like their father figure killed by the villains. But for the most part, I do like that there are differences. I'm going to go on a little rant about talking about faithfulness to source material, but I really don't get why people like to get so hung up on things when they're not exactly how they were originally, because I would rather them do something new in an adaptation rather than just do the same thing that was done in the comics, because it's not like creating a new adaptation is going to remove the original. The original is always going to be there. So I always feel like it's cooler to do something new than to just repeat the same thing over and over again. So I do like that he's mostly different from comic Spider-Man. Now I'm going to talk about the overall structure of the season. This is my biggest problem with it, because it's basically all episodic, and that's not to say the episodic shows are inherently bad, but when you have an episodic show, there has to be some other hook. There either has to be like some sort of gimmick, like it's an anthology season, or there's interesting characters, and this show just doesn't have interesting characters at all. So when it's a different story every episode and there's no real progression, it's just hard to get through, especially after the novelty of the show wears off, because it is fun at first, like seeing this version of Spider-Man, but it just gets old when most episodes are filler child. Not a lot of interesting stories are really told in this season, so I just think the episodic nature here is just its biggest problem. One of the things that I do like about some of the episodes here is that there are a lot more sad endings than I expected, where Spider-Man isn't able to save the civilian at the end, and it just raises the stakes, because we always know he's going to defeat the monster of the week, but if he can't always save the civilian, then that's just interesting. But there are definitely more problems that are way bigger. One of these is that the show is really tell don't show, and I know this is somewhat in some other older Toku, but here is way more prevalent, where the narrator will just tell how Spider-Man is feeling instead of his actions doing the telling. And I thought that show don't tell was one of the basic principles of his engaging story. But then again, this is for a much younger audience than me, so maybe they wouldn't understand, but I would give kids way more credit than like some kid shows seem to think that they're incapable of complex thought when you can tell them complex stories. So that's a problem I have. But the absolute biggest problem I have is just the ending of the episodes. So many episodes just end after Spider-Man defeats the monster of the week. And by end, it means there's a final shot of him driving off into the sunset or looking off into the sunset while the narrator says how Spider-Man is going to get revenge on the Iron Cross Army one of these days. And so many episodes end that way without tying up the actual plot of the episode. And again, I noticed this a little bit in some older Toku, but here it's way more egregious, especially because it happens in the finale itself. He defeats Professor Monster, he looks out into the sunset, and the show ends. It doesn't tie up anything doesn't reveal whether his family finds out if he's Spider-Man, doesn't tie anything up with like any of the other characters. It just ends, and that's so unsatisfying. That pissed me off when that's how it ended. So that would be the biggest problem, is just the ending of the episodes themselves. They're basically no satisfying endings at all. Probably the most well-known aspect about this show is just its quote-unquote weirdness. And a lot of that comes from its cheap aesthetic, which I'll touch on later. But it really isn't as weird as a lot of people make it out to be. I mean, if you compare it to movie adaptations of Spider-Man, obviously it's gonna look weird because of how cheap it is in comparison. But if you compare it to pretty much any other Toku show, it's not even that weird. It's pretty much par for the course when it comes to other Toku. And even like in comparison to like the Batman show from 1960, that's way more weird than this show is. This show takes itself completely seriously. Really, all the weirdness comes from out of context moments. And there's kind of like 4 or 5 of them throughout the season that everyone knows. Those are like Spider-Man shooting the gun, Spider-Man coming up from the bottom of the bus, Amazon's trying to unmask Spider-Man, he has unlimited masks, and then banging on the wrench. And, you know, those are other like quote-unquote weird moments, like him calling himself the emissary of hell, but he really only calls himself the emissary of hell like 2 or 3 times. Most episodes he just has a random title that he gives himself, which is really funny. And also that he has a car and a mech, but it really isn't as weird as I was expecting. Obviously, it still is really funny because of how cheap it is. There are some shots of when Spider-Man is surprised and it does a zoom in on his face, and it's hilarious. And one other thing that's hilarious, every single time he calls in Marveler, which is like his ship that turns into his mecha, he always yells it in such a dramatic way, and the mic always peaks. And it's hilarious every single time. So like those aspects make the show more entertaining, but if people are going in expecting like the weirdest show ever made, they're probably not gonna find it here. The action was a huge letdown. I was expecting some pretty cool action because, like I said, in that documentary, they talked about all the climbing stunts they did, and some of the climbing stunts are pretty cool, but a lot of them look really corny. And then the action itself, when he's fighting, he almost never fights the monster of the week. He always just fights the grunts, and a lot of the action just looks so awkward. A lot of it is just Spider-Man slowly climbing away from them, and then they're kind of just staring at him. It's just so boring. Like, it's Spider-Man. He can do flips, he can climb on walls, he can swing, but most of what they do is just have shots of him climbing and then doing some pretty like bad action. So that was really disappointing. That's not even to mention the mecha action, quote unquote, because this is the worst mecha action I've ever seen in any show. From episode 1 to 12, like, it's par for the course mecha action. It's whatever. I'm not a huge fan of it anyway, so it's whatever. But from episode 12 onwards, there's not even a fight. The monster grows, he calls in his mecha, he immediately uses the finishing move and it explodes, and that's it. And in some episodes, he doesn't even have to transform into the mecha. He just shoots it with his ship a couple times and they die immediately. So what's even the point of these segments? They literally take like 20 seconds. Do they really need to fill 20 seconds? That's crazy. And there's a reason for this. I'll touch on it later, but it was just horrible. What were they even thinking? Now I'm gonna talk about the aesthetics, and this is definitely the easiest part of the show to clown on, because it's pretty obvious they had basically no budget to make this show. The Spider-Man suit looks so cheap. It looks like it belongs in a parody. Like, I've seen fan films with better Spider-Man suits than this one. From some angles, it looks decent, but a lot of the time, it just looks terrible. Like, even the mask, you can like see right through the mask, and it looks so bad. Leopardon is a fine-looking mecha. Pretty generic, but it's pretty cool enough. The music is still really good. It's composed by the same guy who did a lot of the early Super Sentai seasons, did all of the Space Sheriff seasons, so it's a very groovy soundtrack, very good opening theme, alright closing theme. At least the music is still good. Like I said, because of the cheap budget, they couldn't afford to film any more mecha action after episode 12. A lot of people say that it's because they lost the Leopardon suit, but it's actually because they just didn't have the budget. So they were so strapped for cash that they just had to reuse mecha footage after episode 12, which is kind of crazy. So quality-wise, the show isn't exactly the greatest. It has its novelty, but in my opinion, the lasting power of this show is how influential it is. And I think to explain how much of an impact it has on tokusatsu as a whole, I have to explain the production of it. The show came about with a rights sharing deal between Marvel and Toei, where each of them were allowed to use their IPs in any way they wanted. Toei originally planned to use Spider-Man as a supporting character in another show, but then they developed it where he's the main character. They obviously switched some of his origins around, and they added Leopardon, the mecha, mostly because of the popularity of mecha anime at the time. And they thought that in order to grab the attention of younger audiences, they introduced the mecha. It debuted in 1978. It replaced Jacko which is the second Super Sentai series, struggled really poorly, especially in comparison to Gorenger. And despite Spider-Man only lasting 41 episodes, it was apparently very popular because Leopardon was a very high-selling toy, the thing that financed the entire show, basically. So much so that the next show that Toei made with Marvel, Battle Fever J, had a mecha of their own, and from there Super Sentai added its most recognizable characteristic, which is the mecha. And from there Super Sentai continued to do well, and Marvel really didn't end up using any of Toei's properties. There was a pitch that Stanley made to adapt Sun Vulcan for a Western audience, where they would take the in-suit footage and reuse it while filming new footage of American actors, but no network picked it up. And then after the conclusion of Sun Vulcan, the deal between Marvel and Toei ended. And then fast forward to the 90s when Haim Saban pitched the exact same idea as Stanley, except he used Bioman. And the head of Fox Kids at the time, Margaret Loesch, who was on the team with Stanley while they were pitching Sun Vulcan. So she picked up the idea, and they used the most recent Sentai season, Zyuranger, and then from there, Power Rangers was born. So if it wasn't for Japanese Spider-Man, then there wouldn't be any Power Rangers. There probably wouldn't be any Super Sentai past Jaka. And then because of Power Rangers, it introduced Tokusatsu to a much wider audience than it would be otherwise. And then I would have never been exposed to Tokusatsu at all. So in conclusion, is Japanese Spider-Man the greatest Toku show ever made? No, absolutely not. Not even close. It's just too generic. And once the novelty wears off, it's not a very good show. But is it the most influential Toku show? I think it is, in my opinion. And I forgot to mention this before, but it was one of the first live-action adaptations of Spider-Man at all. I think the second of all time. So it's pretty influential in that regard. But in terms of Tokusatsu, it's introduced the idea of mecha to Super Sentai, and that kind of made Super Sentai what Super Sentai is today, or what it was. And how it became super successful is through the mecha. And if it wasn't for Super Sentai continuing, then there wouldn't be Power Rangers. And then Power Rangers blew up in the 90s, and that exposed a lot more people to Tokusatsu than it would be otherwise. Probably still would be fans, but even as niche as it is now, it would be even more niche. And a lot of my childhood was Power Rangers, and some of it was also Spider-Man. So it's cool that a Spider-Man show was responsible for another part of my childhood. Even though I don't think Japanese Spider-Man is a particularly good show, it has its moments certainly, but it's not what I would call a good show. It still means a lot to me because of how much it meant to expand the Tokusatsu, pretty much paving the way for Power Rangers. So for that, I'm always grateful for it to exist. So thank you very much, Japanese Spider-Man. Thank you for watching, and hope you enjoyed the video. This is a show that I've always wanted to watch for a while. It's always intrigued me. It's just a big part of Tokusatsu history in general. So even though the show itself was a disappointment, it's still cool that I actually got to see a different version of a superhero that I know very well, in a format that I very much enjoy. So as for my next video, still not exactly sure. Might be on ranking the Super Sentai changers. Down the line, gonna tier rank or rank the opening and closing themes of Super Sentai. I'm making my way through the Metal Heroes seasons. I finished Just Beyond a couple months back, so I got like 11 more seasons of Metal Heroes to go. But once that's done, I'll rank all the Metal Heroes seasons, maybe make a couple of videos on Metal Heroes, and then we'll see from there. So thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed. Feedback is always appreciated. Have a great day.